everyone, I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and today we're going to do a project that I can't believe I haven't done in over 640 episodes of Dyepot Weekly yet. We are going to look at the depth of shade of fiber reactive dyes on wool yarns and on cotton yarns to compare that intensity of the color that we see. Depth of shade is a numerical representation of the amount of dye that you are using per amount of yarn, where a 1% depth of shade would be 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. And so if we take 1 gram of a fiber reactive dye and apply it to 100 grams of a wool yarn versus 100 grams of a cotton yarn, how similar will those final colors be? Both in the saturation of the colors, but also in terms of the hue. And that is something I honestly don't know. Fiber reactive dyes are unique because you can dye many different fiber types. If you're adding soda ash to make your situation alkaline, you can dye your cotton yarns. And if you're using an acid like vinegar or citric acid, you can use your fiber reactive dyes like acid dyes. So they can be used in the same techniques I use in most of my videos. And you can apply it onto wool. Which means that 1 gram of dye on a wool-based yarn will probably exhaust completely. We can expect the majority of that dye to enter our wool yarn. But whereas for our cotton yarns, when we set up a fiber reactive dye with soda ash, those are conditions where the dyes can also start to interact with the water. And so you always are going to have some amount of dye that gets rinsed out. So will the colors be a lot less vibrant on cotton than wool? And to what extent? And this is what I don't know, and so we're gonna try this out and see where we go. Our wool-based yarn today is actually technically a blend with nylon. We're gonna use Stroll fingering weight yarn. This yarn is 75% superwash merino, 25% nylon. And I picked it because this is the yarn I dye the most. And so I'm the most familiar about how it takes up colors from my acid dye line. And so I thought it would be good to use here. For our cotton yarns, we actually have 2 different bases. They are both part of the Simply Cotton line from Knit Picks. The only difference is one is fingering weight and one is worsted weight because I did not have 2 of the same in my stash. And this yarn is 100% organic cotton. I took all of our yarn and pre-soaked it in plain tap water overnight. We did not add any acid or soda ash yet. I decided to pick 2 dye colors that maybe will help us visualize if we have a very different intensity of color on our yarns. One of them is a black Raven. These are both Dharma Trading Company's fiber reactive dye line. And then the other is a red, fire red, because a red is a color that, like, if it isn't intense enough, then that is something noteworthy. Similarly with a black, and I have a feeling using 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn, we may end up wishing we used more of both of these colors on both our wool and our cotton, but this is a starting point. This is a baseline. Let's go dissolve our dyes. I put on my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves, and measured out 1 gram of each of our dye colors twice. Then I dissolved our dye in hot tap water. Since we have no soda ash mixed in with this water, I'm not worried about the fiber reactive dyes reacting with the water, but we will be adding these dyes onto the yarn as soon as we can. I'm not stressing about the total of volume that I'm adding here, but I know we're at approximately a cup of liquid. And maybe I'll measure the volume of one of these cupfuls in the end.
Side note, the Raven Black broke in this really pretty way when I wiped up a little powder on the counter.
Now that the dyes are dissolved, I'm going to let them just sort of sit for about 10 minutes before we go ahead and add them to our yarn. Mainly because sometimes, especially with colors like the black that break, sometimes there's some pigments that dissolve faster than others. So just giving it a minute to sit and stirring occasionally can really, really help. Our goal today is to look at the depth of shade, right? Where we're gonna have 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn and see where that color ends up. But the techniques that we're gonna do and sort of how we're gonna get there will be different when we're dealing with our wool or our cotton yarns. We're gonna use different pH modifiers, soda ash for the cotton, vinegar for the wool. We're gonna have a much bigger volume to distribute the color on the wool than we will with the cotton, because fiber reactive dyes can react with water, and so we want to have as little water there as possible so more of the dyes will interact with the yarn. And eventually we're gonna apply heat to the wools, and we're not planning on doing that to the cotton. And so a lot of times when I do a comparison, I try to keep the techniques as similar as possible. But again, the goal here is the total amount of dye on our yarn. And so on that note, let's go prep our soda ash so we can pre-treat our cotton yarn.
All right, I am going to measure out about 1/4 of a cup of soda ash. And since I'm dealing with a powder, I am wearing my deluxe rubber respirator mask, safety glasses, and gloves because I like to protect my lungs. It's about 1/4 cup, and now I want about 4 cups of hot tap water. 4 cups of water is approximately 1 liter. Now, normally I would potentially have the water in here first and then add the powder, but the soda ash is very soluble. Now, it will look cloudy at first until it all dissolves, and so I'm going to stir it with my gloved hand for a little bit until it is a lot clearer. Now that our soda ash mixture has dissolved, I'm going to take the yarn and remove as much of the pre-soaked liquid as I can squeeze out. Now, 4 cups of water is not a ton of liquid for 200 grams of yarn, but I've done this when I just didn't want to waste soda ash, and so I did this proportion and dyed a ton of yarn and even a shirt with it the other day. Now, I have done some shorter pre-soaks in soda ash. I don't know how much time is really necessary, but I'm going to set this aside and let it pre-soak for at least 30 minutes today, and I'm just going to cover it so I can set it aside. Oh, I can take my mask off now.
I could have taken it off as soon as there was no powder. But part of the reason for this is I also had technical difficulties today that led me to be a little flustered. And I want to be unflustered when I set this up because I'm very excited about the results. And sometimes when there's something that flusters you, you need to just take a step back for a moment. And this water I'll toss. Here I have 2 more plastic shoe boxes, and we're going to add in our cotton yarn. I am going to take 100 grams of our yarn and squeeze out as much of the liquid as I can before bringing it into its own container. And I'm going to do the same thing with our fingering weight yarn, and I haven't decided which yarn is going to be which color. Now, as for the soda ash, I'm going to hold on to it just for a day or two in case I think of another cotton dyeing project I really want to do. Okay. Let's start with the red. Okay, I'm going to take our dye. I'm going to move the other one further away. Going to take the dye stirred up, and I'm going to fill this container right here with water. Just a bit to like a finger's width below the top. I will measure this volume near the end, but I have a feeling we're approaching like 1 cup of volume. Now I'm going to take this color and pour it over the yarn and immediately start scrunching it through. So this color does not look that intense to me. But that's okay. We'll see what it looks like on the wool. It might be a color that is not super intense. I did not look at the recommendations on Dharma's website for the amount of various colors that you should add. I believe that they have recommendations for on weight of goods, but the goal here is to just try to get this color all over the yarn as best I can. And I'm going to go rinse off my hands, and I'm going to grab a lid to set this aside. Now the reason why I'm not adding more water volume, because in alkaline conditions that we create with the presence of soda ash, as I add a little bit more water, the dyes can react with the water and then be unable to form the bonds that they form with the cotton fibers. And so this, ooh, this is cool. As I pour that on. And so if I had more water volume, we would probably end up with a lighter color overall. And this is something that I do want to play with intentionally. I would love to play around with dissolving our fiber reactive dyes in different volumes of water to then see what we end up with. Now, but if you think about like tie-dye situations, the more water you have, the lighter the color usually ends up being. Okay. And so the concentration of these dyes tends to be fairly important. And so I think that if I added a lot of water at this stage, we would have more pigment that is wasted. Whereas when we use these dyes with acid on wool yarn in a little bit, they will exhaust completely in that situation, which means that all of the dye that we add onto the yarn will end up on the yarn, and it's sort of independent of the water volume, so I can use more water there to get even coverage. But before I pop the lid on here, I know I'm leaving a little bit of dye behind. I am going to fill this container similar amount to what I'd used before. Okay, and we have almost exactly, in this case, 200 milliliters, which is shy of a cup. And I'm going to test my measurement with the red because the cup is a slightly different size. Yeah, I would say around 200 milliliters of volume total is what we had, which was a nice amount for spreading really easily over 100 grams. And I'm sort of bringing this up in contrast to when I did like my quote layered tonal technique on 200 grams of yarn using a similar volume of water that I'm using right now. And in that circumstance, we weren't really able to get all the colors 100% all over the yarn, but we could with some effort. Now, this color feels a little bit like a light black to me. If I zoom in and it's overexposed, you can see some areas that are more saturated and less saturated, which is nice. We're gonna have a tonal, but again, I'm gonna set this aside to sit at room temperature for a couple of days. With fiber reactive dyes, room temperature and time is what we need for them to set. And we can use this kind of effect on wool-based yarns, but on wool, I will still want to add a heat step at some point in the end. Let's talk about cold process dyeing yarn. This is where you set up your yarn and your dye and you let it sit for a couple days at room temperature or outside. And this is something that's very standard for dyeing cotton with fiber reactive dyes. If you've ever done tie-dye, you know you apply the dye and then wait a couple days before you rinse out the dye. You don't necessarily need to apply heat. But when you're dyeing wool with acid dyes, you do need heat as part of the process. But you can do something similar where you set everything up at room temperature, let it sit overnight, and then steam set it after the fact. This is something that can come in handy sometimes because for me personally, because I have a lot more plastic shoe boxes than I do metal dye pots that I can heat on the stove. And so it can allow me to dye a lot more yarn all at once. And yeah, it can make it almost assembly line-esque. And in today's case, it means that I'm setting up our yarn in similar looking containers. And so that is just visually satisfying for me. But I could have set up the wools in just regular dye baths and gone and heat set it. Dyeing wool-based tonals this way is really, really easy. I'm going to take our dyes, add them in to each respective container. And what's funny, I don't know if it's showing up on camera, but with our black dye, I did see a rogue red speckle on the bottom there, which is worth keeping in mind. But it's a little bit easier to set this up because we have a much bigger volume of water than what we had last time. Now, there's no acid in here yet. I'm bringing over one of our skeins of sock yarn where I had removed almost all of the liquid, and I'm going to add it in, sort of moving things around. Now, yes, this red color is on the lighter side because even at we haven't all absorbed it, but you can see that we've got sort of this watermelony color here. I could tell when the dye was not super opaque that it was not going to be that pigmented, which isn't a bad thing. It was just, this was a starting point for this color. But one of the reasons why I added the yarn to the water before adding any acid is that some pigments will soak up onto yarn so fast once you add acid that I wanted to try to get coverage of the dye all over the yarn. Now, if I wanted the most even coverage, we started with 8 cups of water in here, by the way. I would do this, I would remove the yarn before adding the acid. I don't care if the color is uneven. I just added 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. Now, my tap water is slightly acidic. And so I do find that some colors will really start binding to the yarn before I've even added any acid. And I'm trying to see, maybe the color is a little darker, but sometimes once I add acid, with certain colors, the yarn will just sort of soak it all up cold really, really fast, which it's not entirely doing here, but we are pretty good to set this aside for a couple of days before we steam set. Now, I could have just kettle dyed this, but I figured if I'm setting something up for a few days while I wash the cotton yarn, which washing cotton can take a while, I may as well steam this at the same time. But I'm going to pop my lid on here before bringing over the next skein to do the same thing in our black dye. And you can tell that this, you couldn't see the tablecloth through. This is a lot more pigmented. Of course, when I bring up the yarn, the color at first is more, it's a very beautiful, like stormy blue gray. Now, I know that this particular black is one that is a little bit bluer. I think that there's an ice dye picture of it and it breaks with blue, and so that's what I picked it for. Let's go ahead and add 2 tablespoons of white vinegar. Now, this is also the point of time where it's important to remind everyone that just because all fiber reactive dyes can be used as acid dyes, the reverse is not necessarily true. I'm sure that there could be some acid dyes in the acid dye line that are actually fiber reactive pigments, but I would not take a pigment marketed as an acid dye and then attempt to use that on cotton. Now, I can tell, which maybe you can't, I think that some of the pigment is clearing a little bit. At least the water as I move it is feeling a little bit warmer toned to me, which is interesting. Now, yeah, and it's like underneath the dye you can kind of see the yarn a little bit. Now, we may end up wanting to add more acid, but let's start with this ratio of 2 tablespoons of vinegar to 8 cups of water. That is what I've used many times in the past. I added acid, right? Confirmed on the instant replay that I did add acid. Okay, that is good. But just to show, we have, I'm sure that this will be like a grayish color and then a light red. I think both of them with these particular colors are colors where I should have added more. But I'm still excited to see how these compare to our cotton when everything is said and done. But now I will see you in a couple of days to heat set these and we'll see how they're doing. One other reason for doing the cold process with these pigments is just to get more of a feel for how these pigments work compared to others that I use more often. It is Monday. Here are our black yarns. And here are the reds. Now, I wanted to show things now because I wanted to be able to compare the yarns a little bit while they were wet and not just while they're dry. Because right now things look very similar. What I'm going to do, show you that the dye bath here is clear. I am going to steam set this. This is a beautiful gray, definitely not black. And which means it's definitely not going to be black once it dries. And here's our red, which, you know, right now I would call it a light red. And let's see. Yeah, that dye bath is clear, which is fantastic. But I'm also going to dump this just because now we can see all of our colors a little bit better. And things are very similar. I mean, if we focus on our blacks alone, I would say the cotton looks more saturated right now. It looks like there's a deeper, more intense color. Of course, we have to wash this, so it may feel different after. And this one, our wool definitely feels maybe a hair more blue, but it could just be a saturation difference. You know, with the reds, maybe I could say the same thing. Maybe the color is feeling a little bit lighter on our wool than it is in the cotton, but like just a smidge. It's very interesting though. But now what I want to do is go ahead and steam set our wool yarns, just so that way we know that the color is well set. The color is definitely all there. It's just a little bit of heat. Occasionally there are some pigments that do need heat, so we're doing that just to be sure. Now I don't want the yarns to touch each other as I am steaming them, just because I don't want to have any color transfer. But in the steamer basket that goes with my 12-quart pot, I can arrange things in like this. And then I'm gonna pop it in, steam it for 30 minutes, and I'll show you what it looks like in a little bit. Now, as for our cotton yarns, there is no need to steam set anything. None at all, because that's not what we do with fiber reactive dyes. And in fact, and you know, this is interesting, but I found that applying heat with fiber reactive dyes did cause some of the pigments to change, but I don't know if that is something that would happen after the dyes have already reacted and bound to the cotton or not. So I don't know in my like heat versus time if that would make a difference. But either way, let's go start washing these. And I'm not entirely worried about back staining, so I figured why not do this without soap first, just to see. Now I am gonna have the water, there's a little bit of bleeding, but there's a little bit of pigments left in there. I'm gonna have the water on, not the hottest, but it's not cold either. And we're definitely seeing some color in there, but it's not bad. I think that if we wanted a more intense color as I bring in the dish soap now, we would need to add a lot more pigment. But I think we've done a good job of like not massively overdoing it. I don't know. All I know is that we're getting some bleeding. Now the color is likely, now that we've washed it a little bit, it's probably not going to change much from where it is right now. And that is just because, again, of experience. Like a lot of times the color will change a lot at first as you rinse out a lot of that unbound dye. But then sort of the more you wash, then it becomes less of a big deal. And in fact, okay, we're still bleeding, but this is really not bad for fiber reactive dye. Now, the other thing I've realized as we continue washing, I did note before we started washing that the color on the red and on the cotton did seem to be actually a little bit more intense than the colors that we had on our wool. Ooh, are we almost clear? No, but not bad. I'm gonna let the yarn soak in some water for a little bit, and I'll keep washing periodically, checking in at the end. But what I've realized is we're not gonna have a comparison right out of the rinse bath. We won't have another damp comparison because by the time I'm done washing these, the other yarn will be hot. And so then, you know, I'll have already put these through the spin dryer to hang them up to dry. But anyway, I'm gonna add a little bit of Synthropol, which is a fabric soap. It is a neutral soap that is good for binding up undissolved dye. So I'm gonna set this aside and bring over the black yarn. Okay, and here it is. Sometimes doing, I'm also gonna start this time using no soap just so we can see. Sometimes, especially when you have a tie-dye t-shirt or yarn that was not like immersed in water, doing a soak for a bit can just help make the washing faster. Now, again, that is not that much color that is coming out. I think that I might be impressed that things are feeling so similar right now. But the thing to keep in mind as I bring over some dish soap, and I could probably remove the gloves, I just didn't want to stain my hands at all. Oh, interesting. This color coming out is more purpley and red. That, I mean, I know that this black is a mixture of different pigments, but it's just always interesting to see what kind of color bleeds out. Okay, but my point is that in my experience, all yarns will look lighter or darker when wet and lighter when dry, but the difference seems to be even more extreme with cotton than it is with wool. And I'm going to be doing the same thing here that we did with our red. It's so funny that this seems to be bleeding like a very similar color, but I'll do a similar soak for a little bit. I'll rinse it some off camera, and then eventually I'll pop back in to let you know how things are going. The washing of, as I add a little Synthropol, the washing of the wool yarns will be way easier. Okay, after soaking and washing, we have almost, actually, this is looking really clear now. Yeah, basically no color left with our red. And probably similar with the black as where it was last time. Yep, that's looking really good. Now, I want to be very clear that the colors could still bleed when you wash it with the first few washes for things dyed with fiber reactive dyes. But after that, then it should be pretty good. But like whenever I tie-dye t-shirts, I always wash them on their own the first few washes. But anyway, I'm gonna pop this through the spin dryer, hang it up to dry, and we'll remove our wool yarn from the steamer basket and wash it. And actually, I just wanted to show the yarn fresh out of the spin dryer. So I removed a bunch of water, and it's already feeling lighter than it did when there was still a lot of water in it. I'm now turning off the heat. It has been 30 minutes. I do not observe any color shift or change in our yarn. And I'm not anticipating that we'll see any color bleeding because our dye baths were completely clear, but I've just removed the hot yarn and I'm gonna go set it aside to cool completely. And I just realized that the angle of the camera's at, it's panning slowly. Okay, we're gonna wash our gray and red yarn. Add a little bit of dish soap. Now, when you're using fiber reactive dyes as acid dyes, you want to wash cold. And that's because this is a circumstance where heat can disrupt the interaction between the dyes of the yarn, which I know is counterintuitive because heat is also required. Heat and acid are required for things to bind in the first place. But you can see that with soap, no color is coming out of our yarn. So I'm going to finish rinsing out the soap. But yeah, you're more likely to get bleeding or backstaining with hot water. But anyway, after I'm done rinsing out the soap, I am going to put this yarn through my spin dryer. Just to remove some more of the water. It makes the overall drying process go faster. I'll hang it up to dry and we'll take a look at all of our yarn. Before we go look at the finished yarn, I needed to give one more comment on depth of shade. So yes, a depth of shade references a recipe. So it tells you, okay, for this amount, this is the amount of dye I used per the amount of yarn, where again, a 1% depth of shade is 1 gram of dye per 100 grams of yarn. The depth of shade number is not an absolute reference of how saturated of a color you have. More, it's a comparison of one color to itself on the same yarn base. So with one color, you know that a 4% depth of shade is going to be way darker than a 0.25% depth of shade. But if you're using different pigments, say you're using a silver gray versus a black, a 2% depth of shade of those colors, the gray is going to be a lot lighter than the black. And so that's why I say it's a comparison of one color to itself. And so picking that depth of shade doesn't necessarily give you the absolute, this is going to be a pastel, this is going to be a super saturated color. The other thing worth noting is that the yarn base that you're using, the fiber, the fabric type, also makes a difference in how one depth of shade may appear. And I know we're looking at wool and cotton in today's video and the colors are going to be somewhat different. But even if we're using them as fiber reactive dyes and we're dyeing 3 different types of cotton yarn, or we're using these dyes as acid dyes and we're dyeing yarns with different fiber contents, the colors can appear different at the same depth of shade. So there may be a point where you say, okay, to get the same visual intensity of color, I need to dye this 100% silk at a higher depth of shade than I might a wool or wool blend to achieve a similar finished color result. And I really hope that I'm not making things more confusing here. I do have some videos where I go in and talk about all the math and depths of shade. Go and check out the FAQ playlist on the ChemKnits Tutorials YouTube channel. And while you're at it, subscribe. But let's go look at our yarn. All of the yarn is dry. We have our wool-based soft yarns here and our cotton over here. Now, on the grand scheme of things, everything is very similar, which surprised me. I guess I expected more of a dramatic difference. Now, there are differences for sure. For example, our red color is absolutely more saturated on the wool than it is on the cotton. In both cases, we kind of have a light red. It is definitely more pink than red, but I do see a saturation difference. Now, would I need to double the pigment to get something similar? Maybe not, but it is absolutely a step difference, just a subtle one. The black comparison is really interesting to me because we have a blue leaning gray in both our wool and our cotton. But the cotton is definitely more blue. It's leaning marine blue, whereas this one is feeling more gray to me. And I don't know how much of it is a saturation difference versus the hue difference. Like if I go into monochrome mode, I would say our wool is a hair darker than the cotton. But ultimately, that comparison doesn't feel completely fair because the color is very, very different in here. So in both of these cases, if I actually wanted to get a black with that color, I would have wanted to use a lot more dye. So yes, there are differences in the way the cottons and the wools came out, but they are definitely more similar than what I intuited. And it was only more recently when I realized that things might be closer using similar amounts of dye than I expected. And so this result is really exciting, and I am really excited to do more with plant-based fibers and more comparisons of plant-based fibers versus animal fibers. And if there are any projects you'd really like to see, please let me know down in the comments. I'm just so excited to explore more. I am Rebecca from ChemKnits, and I love to dye yarn. This whole Dyepot Weekly series started as a way for me to dive in and explore commercial acid dyes and using them on yarn. And goodness, was that almost 8.5 years ago? And so it seems like it's time for me to dive into the fiber reactive lines as well. Now, while I'm excited to explore more fiber reactive dyes, I'm not planning on switching to them entirely because I don't dye plant-based fibers a lot. But if you want the flexibility of dyeing plant-based fibers and animal-based fibers, fiber reactive dyes are a really great tool. You'll just have to keep in mind that things and colors may not turn out exactly the same when you follow the same recipe on wool as it does on cotton, and vice versa. Please subscribe so you never miss a new video, and if you enjoyed this, leave a comment below. Thank you so much for watching.